Hey everybody, Jeff Oriema here. About a year ago, I wrote a blog post called You're All Staff Engineers Now. Don't get excited, I'm not promoting you. I'm also not arguing that job titles have become meaningless, although some companies seem committed to proving that point independently. The premise of my post was that AI-assisted development was making code cheaper to produce, and engineering organizations would eventually adjust their expectations around that fact. A year later, I think the premise basically holds up, although I would phrase it a little more carefully now. The cost of producing a plausible implementation is falling. Getting from plausible to correct, useful, secure, maintainable, and worth shipping remains as intractable as ever. I make that distinction because implementation work has traditionally been central to the software engineering career ladder. Junior engineers start with relatively constrained tasks. Over time, they learn how to estimate work, test assumptions, navigate a codebase, recover from mistakes, and recognize when a seemingly simple ticket is actually connected to 6 years of technical debt and work around that accordingly. Eventually, some engineers develop influence and expertise that extend beyond the code they personally write. We tend to call that staff engineering. One of my favorite books about this is Tanya Riley's The Staff Engineer's Path. Riley describes several common staff archetypes. The tech lead guides execution across a team or group of teams. The architect provides technical direction across a broad domain. The solver takes on difficult, ambiguous problems that do not fit neatly into anybody else's backlog. The common thread amongst all of these is leverage. Riley puts it this way, quote, "Everything you do has a high opportunity cost, so your work needs to be important." End quote. Historically, that expectation distinguished staff work from much of the implementation work happening elsewhere in an engineering organization. Writing production code was expensive, so to speak. It required time, concentration, familiarity with the system, and enough hard-won wisdom to know which clever-looking abstractions could result in a 2 a.m. page. That work also gave engineering managers a fairly legible way to evaluate progress. The code worked, or it didn't. The feature shipped, or it did not ship. The engineer gradually became capable of handling larger changes with less supervision and better judgment. The path was imperfect and winding, but you could see how doing the work produced the skills required for the next level, whatever that might be. It varies from org to org. Agentic coding complicates this arrangement because the connection between writing code and demonstrating engineering ability has become less direct. An engineer can now expect to produce several implementations quickly, compare them, test them, discard them, ask the model to try again before lunch. In some environments, brute forcing an implementation toward correctness is actually, arguably at least, a reasonable development technique. And that shifts my attention toward the decisions surrounding the implementation, the part that remains intractable. Those decisions include acceptance criteria, automated testing design, architectural fit, performance, scalability thresholds, monitoring, and whether or not this is the right thing to build at all. Again, these aren't new questions for engineers. But I put these in the domain of staff engineering because they require high-level judgment, and the cost of failure is high. Software teams are beginning to coordinate work across humans and models, often without having a particularly good vocabulary for what they're doing. Somebody has to decide which agent gets access to which repository, the context it receives, and the operations that require approval, review norms, and when the output gets promoted to prod. That person is now managing epistemology. In other words, whose output counts as truth, under what conditions, and with what supporting evidence. This is my justification for the statement, "You're all staff engineers now." As implementation gets cheaper, organizations may expect engineers at every level to exercise judgment that used to develop much later in their careers. Management will probably find this very exciting. Management loves discovering that everybody can perform higher level work, especially when this discovery does not involve higher level compensation. There is a serious problem hiding inside that expectation, though. Staff engineers are usually good at these things because they spent years doing implementation work. The judgment is valuable because it was earned through contact with reality. If companies use AI to eliminate the early stages of that development, where will future staff engineers come from? That is part of the AI coding conversation that I find underdeveloped. There are plenty of influential people who seem eager to reduce the number of entry-level engineers because a model can now complete many entry-level coding tasks, at least at the surface level. Maybe that improves the next quarterly earnings call. It also removes the environment in which people learn how software systems actually behave. The industry still needs an apprenticeship model. It just might be different than what it looks like right now. In the original post that I wrote, I proposed a title that might sound absurd: Junior Staff Engineer. Staff engineers are defined partly by scope and influence, so attaching a junior to the front creates a small organizational contradiction. And I like it exactly for that reason. It forces us to imagine what early career development looks like when implementation is no longer the only or even the primary way that engineers contribute to a team's success. A junior staff engineer might work with more experienced engineers to coordinate human and agent workflows. They might review generated implementations, learn to identify architectural consequences from that process instead. They might investigate failures produced by the interaction of several individually reasonable changes. And they'd still write code because writing code remains one of the best ways to understand software. And they would become more selective about where direct implementation provides the most learning or the most value. This apprenticeship will require more deliberate mentorship and sponsorship. Early career engineers would need exposure to architecture, system boundaries, observability, security, domain modeling, and technical decision-making before orgs have traditionally expected them to engage deeply with those domains. So orgs will need opportunities to make bounded decisions and then observe the consequences. The senior engineers mentoring them, or shall we say the senior staff engineers mentoring them, would also have to explain more of their judgment. And that may be the hardest part of this entire proposal. Experienced engineers are very good at saying that a design feels wrong and considerably less reliable at explaining which accumulated disasters produced that feeling, at least if they're not given the dedicated time to do so. So that needs to be part of the consideration here. Now, I'm not especially attached to the title Junior Staff Engineer. I just think that it illustrates the problem space in a memorable way. Software engineering career progression was built around a world where implementation was relatively expensive, experience accumulated through that implementation process, and broader technical judgment was an emerging quality over time. AI is changing the way that corporate leaders see the economics of that system faster than they are changing the way they develop engineers. And companies can respond by cutting the bottom rungs off the ladder, right? And hoping experienced engineers continue to appear somehow. And they can also redesign the apprenticeship so that engineers learn implementation alongside orchestration, verification, architecture, and judgment. I like that second path a lot better. Second path will be challenging, full of trial and error, but I like that better than the alternative because I believe it gives us a chance to preserve software engineering as a craft while acknowledging that the daily work is changing. So, congratulations, you're all staff engineers now. Your promotion paperwork remains unavailable. What do you think? Any hot takes on my hot take? Drop a comment below, let me know, and don't forget to subscribe. That's it for now. See you next time.